If I can, Charles and Craig, however you want to allocate your speaking time, you're on.
We'll stay on schedule. Don't worry. This is a tag team, and you know, in professional wrestling, tag teams have to be precise, or they don't look good. Anyway, when we were asked to think about agency theory, and first of all, it's great to be back to Wake. This is a great conference. I've been at this conference, I think, 3 or 4 separate times over the years, Alan, and and out of it came 2 really good articles. So thank you. It's a fun conference. I've met a lot of folks. I've seen today some folks I hadn't seen some time, and met some new folks too. And that's the real value of this conference. And appreciate it. Appreciate the hospitality. The issue or the question is pretty good. Agency theory is still viable, and the answer is yeah, it is. I've spent my career in corporate law looking at agency theory. I mean, agency theory typically is around which the corporate law is really based, if you think about it. How do you get the agents, a la managers, directors, employees, to do the bidding of the principals, the shareholders? Legally, we've come up with one way is fiduciary duty. You know, either do it, duty of care, duty of loyalty, neither don't be slothy, don't be sleazy, or else. I've never thought that was a great way of doing it. And I've sort of spent my own career on the incentive side, that the way to resolve the problem is through incentive, equity ownership amongst directors, managers, etc. But this conference has a bigger question to it. Is it still viable? And you know, it takes someone who hasn't been in the business to look at the business and say, you guys are all wrong. And that's where it's good to have, you know, a former student coming out of the finance area to say, you don't know what you're talking. Well, now you know what I'm talking about. Because agency theory is still viable, but agency theory has to be viewed as a subset of a different way of looking at the corporation. And so I'm going to let Craig sort of take on that. And if it makes sense, it's my responsibility. And if it doesn't make sense, blame him. Anyway, no, it's his idea. But the idea basically is that while agency theory has a great explanatory force of the corporation, we don't view it as entirely explanatory. And there's something else, and that's the reason that despite the work we've done in agency theory over the year through, again, duty, incentive, we have yet to resolve the fundamental problem of the corporation is how do you ultimately create shareholder value long term? And we've sort of stumbled around it, but the corporate law has been inadequate, I think, at getting at that. That's why we have conferences like this every year. But the idea we're going to talk about is a different way of looking at the corporation, of which the agency theory is a subset. And through this alternative model of the corporation, we believe that the corporate law isn't an adequate resolution of the problem this ultimate explanatory sense has. And instead, maybe we need to think out of the box as well there, too. And the model basically, and I'm going to let Craig get in depth and discuss it with y'all, has to do with the corporation is not necessarily, the fundamental problem is not principal and agency, but the fundamental issue is how to divvy up surplus or value. The corporation is about value, and you have varying groups vying for their share of the value. And how much they should take of that value is up to really up in the air. And in other words, the corporation is fundamentally an organization of continual conflict over value. As opposed to a principal agency, it's a fight between principals and agents over who takes what of the corporate body. And we believe that there is a way that ultimately will produce shareholder value out of this conflict. And with that, I'm going to turn over to my co-author, and I'll be back in a little bit. No good. This is the explainer. I am the solver. So he'll explain, and I'll try to solve.
Thank you. Well, this is, as Charles mentioned, it's a very difficult topic, and I thought it was difficult, but then really fascinating to me, thinking about it over the last few days and the last few weeks, because agency theory really underlies a lot of what we think about in corporate law and in corporations. And then to ask, is it still viable, is sort of to throw a surprise into it, and it requires a lot of thought. So in looking at, I think, a lot of what's written about an agency and what's said, I started to see that looking at the corporation through this vantage point of agency theory leads to a sort of dissolution of it into independent interests, into a multitude of interests. And what I think I'm going to try to accomplish, and maybe it's successful, we'll see, is to take this dissolution and try to form some fundamental cohesion or unity of purpose between the members of this organization, so that it is not necessarily this multitude of interests competing over the value. So to begin, I think that agency theory, or the tools of agency theory, looks at how to design a contract or an agreement between parties with different interests so that the incentives are aligned, so that their interests can become one. And it's come up with quite a number of ways to do this, and it looks at how to monitor these agreements, and it divides the corporation, and it chooses a principal and an agent, and it's about imposing the principal's will on the agent. But no matter what the design of the contract, what the particulars, what shape the agreement ultimately takes, at the end there's a value to the agreement to each party that signs the contract. And agency theory can't tell you what value goes to the first party, what value goes to the next party. It's incapable of it. It's a problem that's completely intractable to this analysis. And we run into the difficulty that if there's a total amount of value to the agreement, or value to the enterprise or the corporation, where one party is to gain, it's necessarily at the expense of the other party, or all the other parties. And this, to me, it's a problem. It leads to viewing the corporation as these independent interests in perpetual and constant warfare, all against each other. It's an opposition of powers to see who, at the end of the day, gains by their involvement with the organization. And this is not good. I think it's a problem. I think we can see it as sort of a repugnant view of the corporation, and it doesn't seem to accord with how we think of it. And at the end of the day, it's undesirable, but it seemed initially, at least to me, unavoidable as something that was inescapable by the parties. And I think it's self-evident that when you look at a lot of the controversies in the news, when you look at a lot of the case law, like Michael Dell and the controversy between Dell and his shareholders. It's not a controversy about how the transaction is ultimately structured or what's the right way to structure the transaction. The reason there's a controversy is because if Michael Dell is going to gain, it's because the shareholders or the other groups have, at the end of the day, lost. But eventually, I think I kind of thought of an interesting way out, and this is where I'll have to play it off you, I suppose, and see if it makes any sense. To anybody who has heard the phrase, every ship needs a captain, it sort of leads us to what is the solution to this constant conflict between all the interests. And then to take this metaphor probably further than it ever ought to be taken, the view initially that we laid out of the corporation is that each individual in it is necessarily, they have sovereignty in their own interests and those alone. And that if the corporation is a ship, each has one room, and the ship, there's nobody to say where it goes. But we know this isn't true. In corporations, in firms, in enterprises, we have directors, we have CEOs, we have regulations, we have formal means of authority. And these groups, this leadership, proscribes the rights, the duties, the obligations, the roles, and the distribution of value between the parties. And this, I think, in the earlier presentation, it leads us sort of to the higher purpose of the enterprise, or what is the higher purpose that an individual is looking for. And it's sort of the same relationship that people have with society, you see. And now if you view this division of the rights and the value by some external party or by some authority, you see that the individual rights to the expression of their power through these conflicts are transferred to some system. This system is what we call a governance system. And that's the governance of the enterprise is where the authority is rested. And now this is important because I think that if we view the distribution, so to speak, of the surplus and the roles of the participants in the enterprise as somehow external to this conflict, I think that we can arrive at some kind of coherent whole, some sort of reason why this has all come together. And now we can say that these roles are chosen arbitrarily, but they're chosen usually with some sort of purpose. And it's a purpose that the individuals, in pursuing their narrow self-interest without giving it up to some system of governance, would be incapable of achieving on their own. And that, I think, is really where the agency theory and the conflict of agency in a corporation can sort of meet some resolution. And now this disjointed corporation, I think, becomes something of a coherent system, of a coherent whole to the participants. And now I think that to get Charles back up to, I think, bring clarity and kind of clean up where I may have missed things, he's going to propose that we have employee stock ownership be broadly based throughout the enterprise. And now there's a lot of reasons against that, according to diversification or whatever, but I think it ties to this view of the corporation in an interesting way. Although there's problems with having broad-based ownership, it provides a sort of communion, if you will, to allow the CEO or the board or the leader, if we accept that shareholder value is the purpose of all this, of this distribution of roles within the company, it allows the CEO or the board or whoever exercises the authority to communicate this so people can understand what it is that they're hoping to achieve by giving up this conflict and this warring of self-interest. And because shareholder value has been accepted by modern corporation theory or a lot of people, it's difficult to communicate to. I think an employee is seen as an amorphous, an anonymous group that is difficult to identify with, and as Charles is going to describe, by making employees owners, it allows a sort of understanding and a communion of interest with that which is the final purpose or the reason why this enterprise is so comprised. So, Charles?
From the clouds back to earth. No, I think the point is that if you look at whether it's debates between employees and management, employees and shareholders, the question is, and I think his point is that ultimately, how do you divvy up the surplus? And that's the fundamental problem of corporation law. How much goes to the investors? How much goes to labor? How much goes to the other constituents of the corporation? In any contract, there are winners and losers, and you try to balance as best you can. Well, how does that apply to the corporation? And I don't think agency law really explains that, and I think that's his point. So the question is, in the modern corporation, where you have this jostling for surplus, I mean, look at the Goldman Sachs debate. Do the shareholders get the money, or does Lloyd Blankfein, or a combination thereof? Who gets the surplus the company has created, that all have created? And I think that one way to sort of get around this, corporate law really can't. I mean, how does corporate law say, you get this, you get that? But if you begin to muddy it a little bit by putting all on the same page, if you will, I think that maybe you begin to resolve it, and I think that's where employee share ownership comes in. It's interesting, the notion of employees owning stock in their companies really goes back to Louis Kelso, and who wrote a book many, many years ago with Mortimer Adler called The Capitalist Manifesto. And the theory of the book was to effectively end sort of labor management disharmony is to make basically employees owners of the corporation itself. And it was a very interesting idea. It played well in the late 50s, but no one was doing anything with it. And Kelso went to Russell Long, Senator Long, at that point was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And in 1976, got the notion known as the ESOP to be given a tax benefit for the creation of these things. And that was going to bring this sort of workers' paradise. And in fact, it didn't. In the end, the ESOP became a fabulous anti-takeover device that was co-opted by managers basically to keep themselves in power. The classic entrenchment device with no real interest ultimately in worker power, worker ownership. But it's not a bad idea, and it's interesting because, you know, in this idea of resolving agency issues, we've talked a lot, making agents principals, principals agents. That's the whole idea between director share ownership, behind managerial share ownership. But what about employee share ownership as well? I mean, what does that accomplish? It's interesting, a couple of years ago, I got a weird phone call from someone at the Teamsters Union who had published a report called The 10 Worst Directors in America. Remember this thing? And I called, I wanted to see a copy of the study. And the guy said, "Oh, you were in it." I said, "No, don't tell me that. I don't want to be in that study." He said, no, some stuff we used. And he said, "Can you send me some of the empirics behind what we used from you?" I said, "Sure, I'll send it. I'll put it in the mail." He said, "No, I need you to overnight it." I said, "Okay." So I FedExed it to him. And 3 days later, my secretary came in with this FedEx package. I said, "Well, why do you send it out?" And she said, "I did. It got returned to sender." I said, "Nobody returns FedEx to sender. What are you talking about?" She said, "No, read this." And it says, "Refused by addressee, FedEx non-union." I said, "That's ridiculous." So I called the guy up. And I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "You run a big pension fund." He goes, "Yeah." I said, "I should have told you, you got to use UPS." I said, "Well, why not FedEx?" I said, "The pilots are unionized." He said, "No." He said, "They are, but the drivers aren't, but they get union scale anyway. We just have this problem in our union." I said, "Wait, you run this huge pension fund and you can't use FedEx. You got to use UPS." He said, "Yes." I said, "Wait a second. I thought you guys were striking UPS." He said, "We are." He said, "But you know something else?" He said, "We're the largest shareholders in UPS." I said, "Let me get this straight." So he said, "The head of the union, Kerry, is like the largest individual shareholder in UPS." I said, "So you got all this capital, financial capital that you hold for retirement. The head of your union is his largest personal investment, is stock in this thing." He goes, "Yeah, and you're striking him." He says, "Yeah." I said, "That's screwy." He said, "I agree." He said, "But at some point, we have a conflict between the organizational side of the union and the ownership side, the financial capital. And at some point, this is going to explode, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens." And this goes back to that point I was making, that if suddenly the workers in a business, the employees interested in the business itself, are as owners, along with the owners, broad-based ownership, maybe you have begun to resolve this conflict a bit over distribution of surplus. It clouds the issue quite a bit, puts everyone on the same page if your goal is long-term shareholder value. In other words, I think ownership does several things. It creates, frankly, a greater enthusiasm for the organization amongst your workforce. I think it creates a much less friction between shareholders and investors, which is the classic form of the debate. But on a fraud basis, oddly enough, it may actually help the organization vis-a-vis fraud and reporting, because the greater the stake of those within the organization, the more likelihood that fraud, bad conduct, is either frowned upon because it harms the larger organization of which the employees are part, or better yet, it encourages reporting up a fraud to those who can do something about it. There was a report done by the National Association of Corporate Directors about 15 years ago, before Enron, that recommended broad-based ownership as the way around fraud, oddly enough. But I think ultimately the notion of this broad-based ownership, Kelso's view, I think ultimately creates a better organization throughout the organization. And if the goal is shareholder value, I think ultimately it creates greater shareholder value through beginning to resolve this debate, this dispute over who gets what in value. It clouds it quite a bit. And rather having this perpetual, if you will, debate, warfare, or from what we stand in the agency game, this debate between, how do we get the agents to reflect the principles? Maybe making agents into principles and creating a corporation based on cooperation rather than dispute over the spoils is the most effective way of resolving the very long-term corporate conundrum and making conferences like this a little less necessary. Anyway, yeah, right on time, Alan. Let's take something. Craig, why don't you come up and make sure we haven't muddled anyone enough. Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah, question over there. A couple questions. Yeah. Oh, whoever, stand up. Be brave.
All right. At what level of ownership would you really anticipate that boost? How broad-based would it need to be? And additionally, would restrictions on the transfer of stock be necessary to have that boost that you're speaking of?
Yes, I mean, well, I think you would basically model it after the transfer of stock, if you will, that you see in executive ranks and directorial ranks. I think you've got to, you put it this way, as long as you're at the organization, and until you leave the organization, that's an important part of your asset structure. Obviously, for lower level employees, the amount of stock and the vis-a-vis compensation, you have to adjust. The key is to give someone enough of a stake in the business, or have a person earn enough stake in the business that they view the business and themselves as indistinguishable. In other words, I'm not working for you, I am working with you together in a cooperative enterprise in which we all create value. I think this goes back to the earlier talk of greater sense of purpose rather than self, elevating the organization of self, where ultimately you create better value for everyone.
I think to answer that question, there's a way that I at least view the organization or the corporation is that there's maybe it's a sectoral analysis. There's something that's essential to it. There's somebody, management or something entrepreneurial that adds value, that enables the corporation to exist for all these people to work together because they have other options. But then there's other jobs within the company that are more task-based and are less really connected to the corporation. Tasks are defined by somebody who's adding value, and the people who are hired to fill these tasks basically give scale to what's the value created by others within the management or the entrepreneur, whatever it be. And I think that within that first core sector, which adds value, ownership is great because they can really see the attachment, and because it's an area where it's more difficult to determine what is the appropriate value to give. It's a looser area. But in that other sector of tasks, it's the factory, it's lower accounting, it's whatever it be. I think ownership may not be appropriate because it's less of a connection to the company, and it's more closely related to the market. I think there's another opportunity to come, and that person will just take it.
So,
the corporation has lots of constituencies besides shareholders and employees, and there may be a good reason to sort of locate this on employees, but the fact that we're not contemplating giving stock to the bondholders and the municipalities that tax the corporate, I mean, there's just so many people who are participants here. One solution is to try to cloud, as you said, this warfare, but the orthodox line is to clarify the warfare away by saying there isn't warfare. It's all for the shareholders, and the rest is done by contract. And and that's to
Basic fiduciary duty.
Yeah, I mean, and so you can try to broaden that group, or you can say there's no conflict here. That we can go back to a place where we say when the employees are able to jockey for a lot here, that's the market in play, but it's the fiduciary duties. I mean, I'm just curious why why we wanna go down this road for this.
I think it's, to me at least, it's almost impossible through contract. And we've always talked about we have fiduciary duties to deal with the relationship between investors and managers. I think it's very hard, even through contract, to create an effective relationship between employees and the corporation itself. Take an airline sometime. They hate working there. And they have a contract and they're paid X, Y, Z, but there's absolutely zero enthusiasm for the organization itself. And an organization that's totally based on customer service, there is none. And the question is, how do you create within an organization a belief in the organization itself? It comes through leadership, and I think it comes through proper incentive. And ultimately, if the incentive isn't there, a la ownership, and the leadership isn't there, you're not going anywhere. Leadership without incentive doesn't get you very far, because at some point people forget the leader. Incentive without leadership doesn't work either. There has to be a combination, which actually why I go back to agency theory, and the idea being the board is there to monitor management and create an effective manager to effectively oversee the operation of the business for shareholder value. But within the organization itself, how do you create the appropriate alignment in this where you have this perpetual, and I think you identify this correctly, dispute over value? Who gets the value that's created? The employee says, I get it, or I should get more of it. That's the nature of obviously union management disputes. managers or the shareholders say, we get it. And the question is, how do you do it? And I believe that broad-based ownership clouds it in such a way that you create more cooperation and ultimately greater surplus if the goal is to better enterprise. People feel better about it, they work harder at it, and ultimately everyone has more to divide, if you will, rather than a fight over a smaller and smaller pie.
I think perhaps the reason that this gets focused onto employees has to do also with I think the liquidity of the markets. Every company is every individual who joins the company does so voluntarily, and everybody does it because therefore it's the best option that they see available. And then this is a problem because there's a difference between the value they get from that joining that company and the value of the other options. So as an example, suppose there's one person who could make $5 with a hot dog stand, one who could make $5 with a hamburger stand, and if they combine it, they can make 15. Well, it's not clear if that each should get half of that, $7.50. One could get 10, and one could get 5, as they did before. And that's where I think we run into this sort of ambiguity. And with more liquid markets, say bond markets, say shareholders, there's less. With employees, there becomes, I think, more of a divergence between the value they get at the company and the next option, which creates controversy, which creates conflict over who gets what.
One final question.
One question. Building on your point, there are more constituents to a company than just shareholders and employees. What do you see in Europe, and what I'm working in my practice actually, is building up cooperatives, you mentioned them already, who traditionally were just used for farmers who produced goods that then the cooperative business would sell for their joint behalf, on their joint behalf. By building cooperatives with different constituent members being different category of members, employees being members, farmers being members, if it's still agriculture, investors being members together with the others, creating a completely different structure where a variety of constituents actually is sharing in the governance responsibility and in the value that gets out of it. The value that gets out of that for each of them is contractual. It's not a surplus value, not something they negotiate on a contract basis. That's basically what it's heading up to now. What you see, for example, that insurance companies in Europe are doing, they are making those who actually bought insurance policies members of a cooperative institution in order to involve them in the governance of that institution, to safeguard their future coverage under their policy. So it's a much broader scope, and perhaps the cooperative actually might facilitate that better than the classic corporate form.
What? No.
I think it's a good thought, and it's possible, depending on the nature of the business, that could be very appropriate. I agree. Thank you.
I'm still a shareholder value guy. And I think the ultimate road to shareholder value is obviously taking care of the other constituencies. I just think ownership amongst the employee constituency is a better way to create ultimate shareholder value. I think the other constituents are better dealt with through typical and traditional negotiation. I think the employee, though, is a different animal vis-a-vis the corporation, vis-a-vis incentive structure, which is why I like the notion of ownership, and why I think the explanatory force of Craig's explanation of the corporation is negotiation over value is quite helpful, and frankly helpful in understanding the corporation, and I think hopefully helpful in redefining a little bit the corporate law's approach to agency. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So our next speaker is Wolf Call from St. Thomas Law School, and Wolf brings in, again, another really wonderfully kind of not in the mainstream perspective, a combined American-European perspective to these questions, and and also a perspective that we should understand that things change over time, that we are not asking a question that's fixed in time and that can be solved, and that's the end of things. So I'm going to ask that if you can to talk for about 15, 20 minutes. We'll just have a little bit of questions and then move on.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thanks for bringing me here at the wonderful conference. Thank you, Madame Dr. Wonderful job. So, I was very happy to hear both Alan and Doug talk about. Is everybody here?
No.
Really?
Mike.
Okay. Better? A little better? Okay. Sorry. My students always tell me I don't need this, but all right. Okay, so neurosis. Both Doug and Al mentioned neurosis. We do the same thing over and over again, and we have our esteemed colleagues at various institutions are making proposals about every 5 years, and they change. So one thing that I'm trying to do is, with admittedly some level of frustration, is to think about, is that necessary? Is there something that we can do? Basically, our scholarship is tracing what happens in Congress to a large extent. And Congress, in cycles, has to reenact, make changes to laws, and we're just following that and commenting on it and making proposals as we go along. So, and this work is largely coming out of my work in the context of contingent capital, which is way more popular in Europe right now. So that's how this project came about, and it's still early stage. So the question really is, can we overcome regulatory cycles? A regulatory cycle is something that we live with, that we have to be happy with, and scholarship is tracing that, making proposals as we go along. Or is there a way to think broader, maybe outside of the box? So here's what I want to talk about. Very quickly, economists work in the context of bank crises. Very quick, historically, where have we been? What bank crises have we encountered? And maybe some explanations as to, and theories as to how bank crises develop. Shared elements, and then what Coffey calls the regulatory sine curve. And I think he has a good point. This is his Cornell piece from February. I really like that piece. I have to tell you this. I'm a little biased, but I think he is exactly right. And he talks about contingent capital, even though only on 2 pages, right at the end. He dismisses it. He had previously published on contingent capital, but basically concluded there is no traction, at least in the United States. So he kind of lets it go in his Cornell piece. So I will talk a little bit about it, give some examples, and then scholarly responses. Coffey is very, very outspoken in terms of how he categorizes some of our colleagues in their responses. He used the phrase the Tea Party caucus to describe Romano, Ribstein, and Bainbridge, I think. So anyway, and then so what's the common denominator in all the things that we're doing? I want to talk a little bit about stable and quote-unquote optimal rules. Is that really what we should be talking about? And I'm surprised that nobody outside of institutional economics is picking up on that. I was very surprised. And then I want to talk a little bit about the background that gives rise to, if you want, this attempt to overcome some of these optimality attempts, and that's dynamic regulation. So this is, and of course implementation. I don't think I'll get to it, but there is a way. I think there is a way to implement it through COCOS. It's not the only way. I think CIA's corporate integrity agreements are a way that have dynamic elements. I think deferred prosecution agreements have dynamic elements. It's not just contingent capital. So there are different ideas I think that we can work with. Okay, so this is Reinhardt and Rogoff. And it's another book that I really like. I've actually just ordered this as a framed copy for my wall to remind me these are cycles, this will happen during my career probably again. Yeah? I'm intending to put that into my office. So we have North America, Europe in blue, Russia, and then Southern America. Now, we see the take-home lesson from this is crisis will come, exist, and will come again. There's no way around it. We're accepting that, except for the time period right after the Second World War, 45 to 71, Bretton Woods. A lot of people are saying this is Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods is the one way, the one time when we overcame cycles. Okay, so here are just the U.S. crises, 13 since 1792, and I included LTCM, long-term capital management, obviously the Great Depression, and now subprime mortgage, 13 since 1792. So it is likely to happen again. Now, some explanations, I'm going to go over this very quickly. Some economists are saying, well, it's regulation. The structure that we have is wrong, and the structure we have is because of the rules that we implement. Others are saying, no, it's really more about what's going on in the real economy. Banking is just tracing that, following what's going on in the real economy. And the others, then again, Kindleberg and Alba, saying, no, we need to look at central bank policy and what they are doing to maintain bank stability. I sympathize, and I want to say that up front with the first two. I think both have valid elements that I'm trying to incorporate. Now, what are some of the shared elements? First, we're dealing with an exogenous shock. What is an exogenous shock? Well, 60 years of real estate prices increasing 10% or so a year. That's an exogenous shock. And banking follows that. Bankers are capitalizing on this. And how are they doing that? Well, they're expanding credit. Yeah? Other exogenous shock. Vast expansion of the railway system. Automation, Ford Tin Lizzy. Yeah? All exogenous shocks. What do we see? We see vast expansion in credit. Expanding credit, giving credit. Yeah? Here in the last crisis, we saw covenant light covenants. Those of you who were in practice then, we all remember that. Yeah, we enjoyed those days, I guess, to some extent. But so the common denominator, or the shared element, is here exogenous shock, then expansion of credit. We're losing, and this is Schumpeter, creative destruction. Over time, things don't work out as well as anticipated, and we see less optimism. And ultimately, with less optimism, we see bank failures. And I think this is a common denominator. If we trace all of this, and this study is only based on 70 countries, those are common denominators I think that we can identify. Okay, now, so this is what's going on in the real economy. What are the factors that lead to this? Yeah? Now the question is, how is regulation interacting with that? And so if we look at what Coffey calls the regulatory sine curve, we identify one, oversight is never constant. It's constantly moving and changing. Oversight does increase right after a crisis. And I think there's some consensus on that. Yeah? As things get back to normalcy, we then see this diminishing. Coffey in his article walks through SOX repudiations and starts talking about Dodd-Frank scaling back on both of those. And I think he has some really good points. So, okay, I struggled with this for a while because I know economists, securities lawyers, we're not always comfortable with describing these relationships, and I'm not saying that this is it, this is absolute. I'm saying there are tendencies, and this is for purposes of the model. So the blue line is the regulatory sine curve. Yeah? And I'm not claiming that it's either one. It could be different constellations. So it could be either what's going on in the real economy, could be financial innovation, expansion of credit. There are various examples. Yeah? So it could be either the red line or the black line. Let's go with the black line. So we start with the exogenous shock and credit expansion. As credit expansion with less optimism, the line comes down, we ultimately end with bank failure. Now, the regulatory sine curve is not aligned with that, it's not correlated. Yeah? So if we go with the theory that the sine curve starts increasing as we see bank failures happening, and political entrepreneurs are utilizing the ability, sort of the public opinion helping them along to increase regulation, we see this happening. So bank failure happens, people get frustrated, and political entrepreneurs, Eleanor Olsen, among some others, using this phrase, we see regulatory expansion. Now that doesn't really help us much. If bank failure is here and regulatory expansion is happening here, that's not what we want. That's suboptimal. I think we can agree on that. Yeah? Okay, so some quick explanations. The first model is really basic political science, Manco-Olsen, 1965, the logic of collective action. That's really what this describes. So we have the financial industry more powerful, more capable of lobbying and being able to contribute to both sides, and the diversified, less well-organized groups, such as in this case investors and shareholders, they cannot influence the legislative political process as well. Yeah? So we have the basic collective action problem. Now after the crisis, that process reverses. We see political entrepreneurs, this is Eleanor Olsen and some others based on Schumpeter's economic entrepreneurs, helping here the public to overcome entrenched business interests. And that's when we see the spike. Yeah? So other explanations, well, it's really all about psychological biases. This is only happening, regulation is only happening after the crises because we see, well, the most significant part and the biggest legislative success stories, if you want, are only happening after the crisis because of psychological biases and the media feeding that. So we have the negativity bias, we have scapegoating, and the desire for equality, all setting in this under this theory right after the crisis. Okay, so some examples, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. 307, no enforcement. Very controversial. Richard Painter, my co-author, Donna's co-author as well, has been writing about this, traveling the country for years. I think he had over 50 or so meetings. All over the country, very controversial. The SEC never enforced 307. Same with 402, prohibition of executive loans, the problem of the revolving door. The SEC is not interpreting 402. Who interprets this? So in trouble. They are writing the memo with 25 other law firms, basically saying those shall not as though generally shall not. Yeah? And the SEC is staying out of it. And then we can argue, well, is this revolving door really happening, and how bad is that? Yeah. People wanting to get into the SEC and then get out again and return to the private sector. 404. Dodd-Frank is now establishing Section 404C, repealing Section 404. Very expensive, lots of studies written about it with different figures. And similarly, the SEC is accommodating new issuers, various rules, repealing the perceived negative impact of 404. Now, what about Dodd-Frank? Well, we have the Jobs Act and the exemptions from, say on pay 404B, 953B, and then 956, and these are just some high-level examples. 956, we see the SEC delegating the decision on defining who is a covered person for purposes of 956 to the firm themselves. I don't know how beneficial that is. We can talk about that. Okay, so these are just examples for Dodd-Frank retractions and SOX retractions. Now, some responses to the regulatory cycle. Coffey says in his February Cornell piece, well, he generally wants to focus on exemptive authority. That's his way of addressing the issue. McDonald, I really like McDonald's paper as well. He presented that at the annual meeting of the Midwestern Law and Non-Economics Society. And so I think that paper summarizes a lot of these tendencies in scholarship very well. So he comes out, I mean, this paper is mostly about explaining tendencies in scholarship with models. I like his regulatory contrarians approach. I think there's some dynamic elements in that. And then also automatic triggers. I'm a big fan of automatic triggers in the context of contingent capital. I like both. Then we have the as labeled by Coffey, the Tea Party caucus, mandatory sunset provisions, and then Ripstein's, Larry Ripstein's general preference for state law. Now, if we look at McDonald, he tries to categorize this, and I don't know if there are clear lines in categorizing. People write about different things from different perspectives, but I think it does work overall. So his model is one. There are those who are saying, well, there's overaction in both phases. And those are, among others, Olson Coffey, Girding, and some others. Kane, one of the few. And the other one here being overregulation is just following a crisis. The last one, well, excessive deregulation during booms. And this is Engel, Croy, and many others. I'm just quoting a few. Okay, so what is the common denominator? I asked myself, what are all these people doing? And I'm not claiming this is right. This is just an idea that I'm putting out there for discussion. And I think one thing that we're all assuming is that it's always, rules are stable. We're enacting rules, they're optimal. They're addressing a given case scenario, and we're assuming the rule is optimal because it addresses a perceived problem. We don't care so much about, well, that problem in a week or two may be coming up differently. Yeah? And so the underlying economic conditions will definitely change. And so maybe the rule is not stable, really. We're assuming it's stable for the given case scenario, and we're enacting as a stable optimal rule, but we're ignoring to a large extent, I believe, that economic conditions will really change, and maybe over time a different rule might be optimal. So this is just an idea. Oh God. All right. Now some basic background. Keynesians say financial regulation for purposes of overcoming uncertainty and building trust is fine. Neoclassics a little more careful, but basically saying, well, if market outcomes can be improved through stable rules, that's fine too. Yeah, we are acknowledging that, and regulation is justified in that way. Austrian school basically says, no, it always interferes with market processes. Now, and this is a fancy title for something that's not so fancy, I guess, but institutional economics basically says, well, we should really be looking at informal institutions. Corporate governance, formal and informal institutions in corporate governance are important, and a learning experience. Yeah, so in many ways, dynamic regulation is built in many ways into institutional economics. However, the assumption in institutional economics is still optimal rules. The rule revision, the learning process through experimentation is based on the assumption that you enact stable rules, and over time you learn what rule is better. There's no element of including a dynamic element into the rule. Yeah? The learning process is based on stable rules. So what I'm thinking about right now is there a way to add dynamic elements to maybe improve that? And I think there could be some. So I guess we can agree that this is suboptimal, yeah, this relationship, for purposes of this model. Now I thought about how can we optimize this? And talking to people, so the goal here really is, how can we support regulators in adapting? How can we set up a system, regulatory structure that helps regulators move away or optimize supposed stable optimal rules? Yeah. And how can we anticipate future changes? And that really, that's really the debate. Yeah? How can you anticipate the possibility of moral hazard and bailouts? Yeah? What signaling devices should be installed intra-firm, firm-specific, that help us overcome bailouts? Yeah? Okay, so with this model, and I'm not saying that either one is right. This is just, these are ideas. Yeah? So one is to say, well, dynamic regulation should really be in a linear relationship, regardless of what's going on in the real economy, expansion of credit, new financial products, whatever it is. Dynamic regulation should overcome it in a linear relationship. Now, one way is to say, well, okay, if the intensity has to be high enough to overcome all of it, the line should really go like this. Yeah? Okay. The other one is to say, well, no, there will always be a sine curve. There's no way around this sine curve. And we acknowledge that there's no way around the sine curve. So dynamic regulation should not attempt to overcome the sine curve, but emulate it, follow it. So the question then is, if we have, for instance, in this one scenario, credit expansion, maybe we should have a regulatory expansion that follows credit expansion. Yeah? Now you still have that problem. If you have a bank failure in this phase, you still have a suboptimal relationship between regulation and bank failure. Yeah? So then, if we acknowledge that the sine curve will exist and there's no way around it, the question then is, how can you structure regulation to help the sine curve be more optimally positioned? Okay, so this is really in the context of cosine and sine. So if we assume that credit expansion is happening here, exogenous shock is here, less optimism, bank failure is down somewhere here, the relationship should really be, the regulatory expansion should be at the highest possible point shortly before bank failure. Yeah? So if we acknowledge that that would be better than the current situation, this situation, the question now is, how do we get there? That's the question of implementation. Now, one way to do it, that I think I will be proposing in this paper, is to say, well, debt equity ratios and capital adequacy ratios can really anticipate credit expansion, assuming the books are right. We have no guarantees that the books will be right. Yeah? If we assume that, maybe if we implement contingent capital securities, securities that are triggered with automatic institution-specific triggers from debt into equity, we're signaling. We're signaling both to regulators, we're signaling to markets. Now, there's a big argument in the community that rides on contingent capital, should triggers actually ever happen? And is the signaling and the existence of the trigger and the security itself sufficient for purposes of improving corporate governance? Yeah? Now, traction of dynamic regulation in the United States, maybe one reason why coffee is backing off from this. There's no traction, I think. In Europe, different story. Credit Suisse issuing 30 billion over 10 years, 11 times oversubscribed. Very successful issuances. Yeah. Now, not all of them have these proposed triggers. The Swiss are probably leading, the Swiss Finnish. They enacted this in March last year. Mandatory for Swiss corporations. They can choose, but it's embedded in the rules. Now, some dynamic elements. Contingent capital as intra-firm is constantly adjusting to market environments. They don't issue those bonds unless they evaluate whether the market environment is appropriate for that issuance. They're institution-specific, so we're allowing management to tailor it with institution-specific knowledge to the given market environment. The triggers are a real problem. Most of the scholarship on the triggers, very controversial. I have 3 pieces in this context. Very, very difficult. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Why don't we take a question or 2, and then we'll try to get back on time. Any questions? We have a break. Let's have another short 5-minute break, if that's okay.
Thank you. That's all it is.
Visuals are very good.
Okay, good.